But we probably should get started. So if everyone could take their seats, I am really happy. I'm really, actually, you guys seem like you're having a good time. Is everyone, why don't you raise your hands if you're happy you're here? Make me feel good. All right, a few. We'll try to get everyone's hand up at the end of the day. Anyway, thank you. I thought that first panel was great. I kind of know all those guys and thought I knew what they would say, but I didn't, and I found it interesting, so hope you did the same. We're going to hear now from another great set of People Nation writers and editors, and the panel will be led by the magazine's feature editor, Kai Wright. He's both an editor and a reporter of great grace and talent. Many of you might know him from his time running Color Lines, which was a terrific organization that he worked at before coming to The Nation. Actually, some of the people on stage, I think, have written for him at Color Lines. Hopefully many of you will write for Color Lines and for The Nation as well. So again, I'm proud to introduce my friend Kai Wright.
Grace and talent. That's right. That's how I want to be known, but thank you, Peter. Welcome, or re-welcome. We are going to have a conversation that I think will have a lot of overlap. I only caught the end of the first discussion you guys had. And so I think there's going to be some similar themes in this, but with some new folks. We're going to talk about reporting from the ground up, which is something that has certainly defined my career. My first two reporting jobs were at community newspapers. I actually don't really know a different kind of reporting other than starting with the communities that I'm part of and finding stories from there. But I think a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about reporting from the ground up is being driven by and having a trust in humans who are experiencing things as opposed to powerful people who are affecting things. To me, that's one of the differences is starting my reporting with people who are experiencing it instead of the people who purport to be the decision makers about it. And so I think that can frame a bit of what we're going to do. To quickly introduce our brilliant panel. We have Julianne Hing, who was in fact, for a very long time, a staff writer at Color Lines and is now covering immigration and the election for The Nation. We have Sarah Leonard, who is a senior editor at The Nation, formerly of Dissent, and is a real thought leader in the magazine about the relationship between movement and our work. We have Danny McLean, who also wrote for Color Lines for a bit and is now a fellow of the Nation Institute, covers reproductive justice for us, but really, honestly, has covered, we kind of call on her to cover everything that has something to do with social justice and race and gender. And we're going to talk about some of her specific work recently. And you have already met Laura, who probably has the most experience in this room of navigating around movement and reporting and thought from the ground up. And so we have a rich collection of folks. And we'll chat and we'll get as many questions as possible into this. But I think, why don't we begin with Julianne, who is covering the election right now. And your mandate, actually, has been to step away from the candidates and not follow. We have plenty of people who are really paying very close attention to what all the candidates are doing, but rather to actually cover this election from the perspective of immigrant communities that are impacted by the debate. And that, as was your mandate at Color Lines as well. Talk a little bit about developing story ideas from that perspective, how that is different from if you're developing story ideas from the perspective of covering candidates.
Yeah, I'll tell you guys.
And you maybe pick up your microphones, I think, right? Sure. I think we need that.
Okay, here we go. Hi, folks. Well, I'll start by sharing with you all how Kai pitched this project to me almost a year ago. So Kai knew that I actually find electoral politics rather tiresome and not that stimulating. And Kai said to me, look, there's this unavoidable year-and-a-half long news moment. It's inescapable and it's going to consume all of us. In the meantime, there are going to be a lot of really pressing conversations that are happening in between, the horse race and in between this half hour's reason to be outraged. And so that was how Kai pitched it to me, and that's how I've tried to approach it with actually limited, with some struggle. So I went to Nevada to cover the caucuses earlier this year, and this is actually the first presidential campaign that I've covered where it's been it's been like part of my main beat. And I was in Las Vegas for a week before the caucuses, and I went to a Donald Trump rally, I went to a Ted Cruz rally, which really shouldn't be considered so much a rally as like a school assembly or something. Everyone sits down, no one stands. And actually, it's very enthralling. It's grueling. It's very exciting, and that's where lots of other reporters are. Chasing around the candidates, trying to figure out how to move the story that day, and I was kind of struggling with it because it's very enticing, and that's what sort of everyone is talking about. And so I got on the phone with Kai, and Kai was like, "Let's step back. Let's talk about." Aside from Hillary Clinton's efforts to reach Asian American voters, step away from the campaign bubble and talk to Asian Americans in Las Vegas about how they're experiencing these elections. So it's just a total reframe of how I started getting sucked into elections coverage, and that means not looking into the center where if you would sort of assume power to be sort of like on a sun with like, this sort of that radiates outwards. Looking at the center, which is the candidates and whatever Politico is covering this morning, but to step away and ask immigrant communities themselves, how are you experiencing this election? And actually, that's where things can actually be learned. There are many people here who, reporters, campaign staffers, consultants, whatever, the election industry never reaches. And these are the sorts of people who have interesting things to say about their place in America, what they see as what they see as their role in this national conversation, which is the presidential elections. And that's sort of how I've tried to, center it, is to stay focused on people. As Kai was saying, I think a big part of it is rethinking authority and power, and not just chasing after lawmakers or lobbyists or congressional aides who can get you closer and closer to what we traditionally think of as seats of power, and talking to more people who are affecting change, often in very different ways in different spheres. I'll stop there.
Let me, in that Nevada example, just real simple brass tacks here. What you're talking about meant also like physically going somewhere else than where everybody else was as a reporter.
Right. It meant leaving behind all the the press gaggle and all the cameras and stuff. I ended up spending an afternoon and an evening posted up outside a Filipino supermarket called Seafood City, talking to people as they were going in to get their dinner and their groceries for the weekend, to talk to them about, hey, what are you planning to caucus? What's this been like for you? Where do you see yourself in this? I mean, these are people who had sometimes never been even asked whether or not they would ever vote, which was stunning to me, because there's this national circus that has descended on their city, and yet 2 miles away from where all the ruckus is, like, some people are completely left out of the conversation entirely.
There's a great deal of social pressure as a journalist to follow the story that is being followed, and that means both in the topics, but also in covering things of where you're physically supposed to be. I think it's just a really great, tangible example of often it is about physically removing yourself from the places of power in order to find an actual meaningful and interesting story. I'm going to skip over to Danny because I want to ask about when you're covering movement, when you're reporting on movement or you're reporting from the ground up, it does also mean navigating your relationship, your own personal relationship and your own politics with those folks. I think so Danny just recently did an amazing story for us on the Black Lives Matter movement and the difference, the tensions that are in that movement right now about the difference between digital amplification and on the ground organizing. And as someone who, we share a history of people who have both been activists and reporters. And so in that story, you're covering a lot of people you know, and a lot of things that you have a relationship to. Talk about when we're covering things from a movement perspective, when we're covering things from ground up, how do you as a reporter show up in that and balance the tensions of challenging people inside a movement?
Well, I think I have that advantage of having worked in organizing and at social justice nonprofits for a long time because I feel really well sourced. I feel like I know a lot of the people who are, leading movements, working in movements, specifically racial justice movements, specifically Black organizing and activism. So. That's the benefit, right? Because for the past 15 years, I've kind of had this interesting career of moving between, I've worked in like corporate newsrooms, for daily papers, but I've also worked at organizations like Color of Change and Drug Policy Alliance and these types of places. But I think what Kai points out and what's important is that brings a great responsibility because I am a reporter, right? So I'm not a PR person for nonprofit organizations. And I try not to be a booster for movements. That's not my job. But I think what I bring is that I'm in a very good position to kind of like eavesdrop and hear about the tensions. And I'm not really eavesdropping, often I'm like participating in these conversations myself. But I am well positioned to hear about some of these tensions that are often not visible to a journalist who is very much on the outside of movement. So for example, I think there are three examples. One is the Black Lives Matter movement story. So, I was sensing this tension between people who, like me, had kind of come up through more traditional types of organizing. So had a really strong sense of base building, had gone door to door, had an idea about the importance of offline relationships and building goals and strategies together, often in spaces that are not visible to everyone, right? But then nowadays, and specifically as it relates to BLM, there's like all this incredible conversation happening online. And I was sensing in some of the conversations that I was hearing, and by hearing I mean like, on Facebook or at conferences I'd go to or just in conversations with friends, that there was a little bit of sense that what was happening online wasn't real organizing and that there was something lost in people's willingness to air each other's dirty laundry, expose certain things about strategy in places that were not private. Often what I do is like, okay, well, you could just look at this as like the kind of insignificant infighting, but really there's something there. And really both sides probably have the best of intentions, if you want to look at it as one side or the other. So what can I do to try to learn about where these different philosophies and strands are coming from? And how can I, as a reporter, tease that out and try to tell a story that's going to be interesting and relevant to people who maybe aren't even in movement? And I did something similar with a story that I wrote about IUDs and long-acting reversible contraception, where here are these pilot programs and these efforts to make this traditionally very expensive form of birth control, long-acting, reversible, but provider-controlled birth control available to low-income folks. And it's kind of hailed within the reproductive rights community as this incredible thing, right? These IUDs that are upwards of $500 can now be accessible to low-income teenagers at free, for free or at low cost. But then I'm hearing these little conversations coming from the reproductive justice movement, which is largely women of color, Black women, Latinas, Asian women, who are saying, wait a minute, we can't really just like hail this as some grand achievement without also taking into consideration the history of reproductive coercion and eugenics in this country. And so sometimes I think that this work can be looked at as like, we're all on the right side of things. We need to be focused on the real enemy, the right. But I think that there are really fascinating tensions on the left and within the progressive movement that need to be teased out. And what I see myself as doing, or what I hope to do, is to bring my skills as a journalist and as a reporter to try to tease those out and really to try to create a space for people on all sides of these arguments to offer their perspective. I don't think anyone typically is out to just like hurt or, within these movements, I mean. I don't think there's like ill will. I don't think that like Planned Parenthood is like trying to, advance the, like has some eugenicist plot going when their health providers are making IUDs available at low cost. But I do think that there's a perspective that maybe they're not hearing. And so I see one of my jobs as telling those stories. And The Nation, I think, is a great place to do that. I mean, I think they're going to play Hot Type, the documentary later, which talks about like The Nation has always been the home for these types of conversations, like that, where the left can really get deep into like, what do we really stand for? What are we really about? And so I feel really lucky that these stories are running there.
Just to put a fine point on it, maybe you feel like you've already answered it, but this question of what is your job, because it came up a little bit at the end of the last conversation, folks wondering about how do they relate. As a journalist, how do you relate to a journalist who cares about progressive politics? How do you relate to editors and to other institutions? Just really putting a fine. What do you consider your job? What is it? If you had to be like, this is what I do. This is what I'm bringing. What is it?
I mean, well, my job is to, do you mean kind of like the mechanics of reporting?
No, I mean, like if you had to define yourself and what it is you're doing in the world, how would you describe it?
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes people will introduce me as or talk about me as an activist journalist, like activist/journalist. And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm doing. And if it looks like that's what I'm doing, then there's something wrong and I need to change that. I think that what I'm doing is covering movements and that I am thinking really hard about what is an important, compelling story to tell that no one else is telling. And then I'm spending a lot of time talking to the advocates and typically I do start, I mean, I think Julianne makes an important point. I think, like in her reporting with the example she gave in Nevada, she's like standing outside of supermarkets talking to frontline people, directly impacted people about, how are you gonna caucus? I gotta admit, and I don't know, I mean, people have different perspectives, but I typically start with advocates to ask them, what are you thinking about working on hearing? And then from there, I'll go to like, okay, well then who's on the front line of this issue? And then my job is to try to convince Emily or Kai or Richard that this is a story, worth publishing in The Nation. So I don't know if that quite gets at it, but
Is it a fair distillation then to say both amplifying and challenging what movements are trying to do?
yeah, I think that's fair. And I think one other thing I'll say is that I think that people, for the most part, really don't understand what organizing is. Like the general public does not know what organizing is. And I think that we saw this in 2008 when Obama was running for president, and there was this whole segment of people that were like, he was a community organizer, as if that's a real thing, right? And it's like, that's actually a thing. And so so I do see part of my job is to really try to explain what organizing is by letting the people who do that work day in and out tell their stories.
Sarah, who, as I said earlier, is really a thought leader amongst us around our relationship to movement and what movements are doing. And one of the conversations Sarah and I have often had is, about whether she considers herself a reporter, and how and what that means in this milieu, and where I land is that Sarah is an ideas reporter, and is really in debate with the left, and I guess I want to just broadly prompt you to talk about that as showing up in a place where you're looking for unresolved questions amongst left thinkers, and how you address that, and what that means as a process, really.
Sure. So I am an editor at the magazine, and I write sometimes, but I do not write as much as these folks here. And so I don't typically consider myself a reporter because I'm not usually out in the field doing the sort of on-the-ground work and interviews that my colleagues here are doing. I started my career at Dissent magazine, which is an almost purely ideas-oriented publication. It's the definition of a small magazine. We don't have a lot of journalists. The type of question that would guide an issue is more or less whither the left, and as it has been for about 60 years at that magazine. And so I do try to think about what sorts of where do we want to be going as the left, and as you say, what is unresolved, and how do we draw on what's happening in movements or in politics, not just to show people what's happening, but to help them think through a set of politics. So an example would be, right now I'm actually working on a piece that I have in fact reported, which is about Sheryl Sandberg and feminism and class. And so while it's sort of about Sheryl Sandberg, what I'm trying to do is work through some questions about feminism and what feminism might mean on the left as opposed to in any number of other spheres like corporate America, and the sorts of people that Sheryl Sandberg at least feels that she's talking to. Also, does everyone know who that is? Okay, I'm not gonna explain it more. Yeah, I'm happy to explain. So she wrote Lean In, sort of a self-help book that she also proclaimed a feminist manifesto. She is the billionaire CFO at Facebook. So what's so interesting about this story is the brief outline is this. So Harvard University owns a hotel. The hotel has an ununionized workforce of housekeepers who are almost all women of color, most of them immigrants, and the hotel housekeeping community in Boston mostly unionized. It's a serious union town, and these women had not yet been incorporated in. So they had been organizing for about 2 years, and they had not been able to get Harvard to help them have a fair process. Harvard was using Hilton, who manages the hotel, as a middleman to deny them a fair process to vote for unionization. And city council people had weighed in on behalf of the workers. It was a huge struggle, and Harvard was being awful, shockingly. And so Sheryl Sandberg came to give a speech at commencement. And the workers asked her if she would lean in with them because they were also working women, and perhaps she could help them. This was a very savvy PR move, I would say. And it was interesting because you always have Sheryl Sandberg up there telling her story about how hard it is to be a woman in the workplace. And then you have these women who are also, they've been organizing for 2 years. They're not professional, like paid union staffers, but they're pros at this point too, and they're telling their stories. And they're like, look, like you start your book talking about pregnancy. Our main problem is pregnancy. Like they weren't getting days off. They would be getting sick and having contractions early. It was horrible. And so they're like, come on, lean in with us. And she said she didn't have time. And she went and gave a speech at Harvard's commencement. And the commencement was being boycotted by city council members. This was a known labor struggle, in other words. It wasn't some sort of secret. And so I was like, okay, this is really interesting. And it's not just interesting because everyone should know about it and then they should go lobby Harvard on the housekeepers' behalf. In fact, the case is more or less resolved at this point. They're negotiating for their first contract. They did manage to unionize, despite Sheryl Sandberg, after over 3 years of effort during which they were constantly afraid they were going to be fired. And but the reason I wanted to write about it was because I thought it said something both about this, this specific case and the specific struggle is very interesting, but the questions it raises about what feminism is and what it is for is also very interesting and very broadly applicable to struggles on the left and how we identify our values. And so I want stories to be able to help us think about our values and our strategies. And so one of the things I'm trying to do in the piece is go through and by the end of it also talk about, so when we have these debates over Hillary Clinton and feminism and that sort of thing, what does that mean? What is it to have symbolic female leaders? What do we require of them? When the left attacks Hillary for not being feminist enough from a class perspective, what do we mean? What are the consequences of that? And so trying to work through those things through an article can be much more powerful and I think much clearer, actually, than having some sort of purely philosophical debate about what like a good feminist is. It's like, well, here you can see that probably being a feminist would not be screwing over these women who are trying to unionize and get decent wages and pregnancy leave, Okay, we can all agree on that. So then where do we take that? So that's a sort of example of the type of work that I personally like to do. But I think more broadly, the magazine is really important because it's a magazine that circulates among large parts of the left and parts of the left that are different from each other. Liberals, leftists, all kinds of people, elected officials, people who are the only lefty in their hometown. And so you have a chance to circulate more or less the information that the left needs to know. And so that's ideas reporting. What sorts of things do we believe in? It's reporting on emerging movements, so we can think about what the terrain of the left is right now and what people's strategies are. And sometimes it's moving in conjunction with movements in a sense. We are not the activists, but allowing movements to direct our attention to important problems usually has both a bigger impact and can be sort of elucidating for us. So I'll just give a quick example, but in Chicago right now, where a lot of the most interesting racial justice organizing is taking place, there was a big movement to get rid of Anita Alvarez, who's the prosecutor, which they have successfully done. And so in the lead up to that, we assigned a reporter to go and look at Anita Alvarez's track record and, really dig in and be like, who is this person? What has she done? And can we make it clear to more people exactly who this candidate is? And that will not only be of use to movement activists who are working on this question, but it will allow us to explore some larger questions about the roles of prosecutors in America. And so we don't go into that thinking like, we're just gonna make like a really useful thing to be like PR for like the movement people, because that's not actually useful, that's not the skill we bring to the table. We bring an investigative skill to the table. And we, in many ways, often have the same questions and concerns as the movements, but we handle them, we process them differently. And those things have to work sort of parallel to each other. And I think that was a powerful piece because as this campaign was ramping up, people wanted to know, like, who is this person I keep hearing about? We're like, we can tell you that. That's a job we can do. And hopefully that was sort of productive on a few different fronts. So, yeah, so
I like this point about ideas journalism coming together with reporting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what the Sheryl Sandberg piece points out, because there's a way in which in today's media landscape, there is as Richard said in the last panel, there is a lot of opportunity, increasing opportunity to write with voice about things, and that's great. That is a wonderful thing. And there's an increasing opportunity to comment on things, which is also great. But the idea that you can use reporting to move an idea agenda and to suss out ideas, and it doesn't have to be Henry Louis Gates in the New Yorker in the 90s in order to do that, right? Like it can in fact be specific movement stories right now that you can go to and on campuses, right? That you can go and report out that are about an idea, and I think the dichotomy between ideas and reporting is something that is damaging, and that's a great example of how they're not separate things. Laura, I'm gonna ask you to talk about whatever you want to talk about, but one of the things is, in terms of relationships to movements. I mean, one of the things that is striking about you to me is just the breadth of movements that you have either covered or been involved in, and the relationships that come from that, and the way that those relationships then inform your work, and so that sort of connects to what Danny was talking about. But talk about how those relationships to movements inform the work that you do, and shape your ideas.
Well, I actually really appreciated your idea of reporting that moves ideas, because I think that's a lot of what I feel I've been doing over the many years. And I'm a little torn right this second. I'm going to show you a quick video, not just yet, of the work that I do right now in a television program that is syndicated and that's also available online. You can go to lauraflanders.com. But while I'm sitting here with Sarah and thinking about journalism and you all, I'm also wanting to talk a little bit about the print piece I just did for Sarah and The Nation on the question of Ireland and the significance of nationalism still in the Irish context, and particularly the work of one party, the Sinn Féin party, which is active now north and south. Because somebody made a joke, it wasn't really a joke, about how long I've been contributing to The Nation, but I do think that the first piece I ever contributed was something like 1989 or 90, maybe 91, because I was covering Northern Ireland and doing this piece for Sarah, which was an opportunity to go back, and the news hook was the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising of 1916, a significant armed rebellion against British Empire. The hook was that, but the reporting took me back to people and to places that I hadn't really been in for 20 years and more. And in doing both the reporting and then putting together a video about the story, I was taken back to look at the reporting I had done in my early 20s. I was 22 or 3 when I first went to Northern Ireland, and I went because I had grown up in England, and I just knew there was another side to the story of the Troubles. Sure enough, the Irish call it the Trouble with England. And in those decisions that you make in those early days about where's your curiosity, what's your question, I think lie values that you will probably, if you're lucky, look back on and realize guided your whole life. So I would embrace whatever the questions that you have right now, whatever the passion that you have right now, before it's been beaten out of you by corporate media and what you're told is credible journalism or stuff that will be good for your future, your instincts right now are probably the best instincts you're ever going to have. And they're the instincts that will serve your curiosity and people who will be your readers and your audience throughout your life, if you're lucky. And if you're lucky means if you have colleagues like Katrina or Sarah or Kai who will encourage you and partner with you and participate in your work. Kai's been a many time guest on my TV show, as has Sarah, as has most of the people you're seeing on these panels, and if they haven't yet, they should be. But going back to that 1984 reporting, I realized, yes, you have to decide, are you going to photograph, particularly if you're taking pictures? And I've always been interested also in not just writing, which I think of as a chance to work out my own ideas, and work that will be potentially useful for research even in the future, and video and radio more as a tool to introduce people right now to each other and to try to broaden the conversation. We talk about giving voice and giving value. So voice to people that don't have a voice in the coverage, a little bit of what Richard was saying about you can use contemporary media to just simply go where there's no coverage. Giving value means taking them seriously enough to actually ask the tough questions, and to valuing the field that you're covering seriously enough to realize that there's actual research and books you can read. I think a lot of people think community organizing, as you said so beautifully, Denny, it's just, you just show up and there it is. No, there's history here. Have you read the biography of Ella Baker? Have you read, Eyes on the Prize? Have you read the history of the socialist movement in the United States? Have you, there is Andrew Kopkind's book, great book to read on covering movements, most of it for the nation. There's research that you can bring to bear to the work that you do. So giving voice, also giving value. But then you have to decide, are you going to cover are your pictures going to be the pictures of the backs of the police? Because you're behind them while they beat up other people? Or are your pictures going to be the front of the police as they're beating up people that you're standing with? Is the first person that gives you a briefing, heaven bless some instinct that I had when I first went to Northern Ireland. I remember I was driven a lot by people I was interested in. I was doing a story about domestic violence in Northern Ireland and state violence and the relationship between the two. And because I was at the early years of the women's movement in Northern Ireland, I was in with all of them. And that's how I kind of came into the scene, was through grassroots groups, women's groups, on both sides of the political divide, or there are many sides of the political divide there, but nonetheless, through that particular lens, I'm a lesbian. There were social connections that I was able to enjoy. Yeah, I was able to enjoy. But who also helped me enter a community through the community door, as it were. And then at a certain point, I remember a reporter or somebody, I needed to get access to the parliament. I wanted to interview somebody finally who was an elected person. And they said, well, have you had your briefing from the equivalent of the State Department? And I had never had a State Department briefing, in Northern Ireland. I felt like I grew up in England. That was enough of a State Department briefing. But I realized, most of the reporters, the very first thing they do is go and get a briefing from the people in power. And I think in most of your situations that you will have that opportunity to have the very first briefing you get on the situation be from the person in power. And I would just urge you to delay that briefing to a moment where you could put you could have some context for it. So I'll stop, but I'll play you a video of, it's a little promo, a little example of, or a description of what I do today. Take a look. Thank you, Andrew.
Too many media outlets turn away the most important stories. I started the Laura Flanders Show because we need a different sort of media. What would our world look like if our news showed us as much collaboration as it does competition? What if we got to meet people making change right here, right now, in all sorts of ways we're usually told are impossible?
What does structural racism look like in this country?
So much of how we've been socialized to be human is to resist change, to try to create these institutions to take over everything.
People are now beginning to question our entire system.
We don't have the state, we don't have the prisons, we don't have the cops, thank God. What we do have is the wild, queer feminists of color, decolonial imagination.
Each week on the Laura Flanders Show, I get to sit down with the smartest thinkers and doers of our time. Forward-thinking people you know, and others you'll want to know. I'm interested in what's going wrong and also what's going right. Meet the people and the movements who are pioneering better ways of living in tune with our ecosystem and each other, and find out how you can help.
Modern capitalist enterprise is the negation of democracy.
Climate change changes everything. We are in for dramatic physical change to our world, one way or another.
We have to see this as a global movement. We can't see our issues as just domestic issues.
The Laura Flanders Show also features exclusive investigative reporting.
What are the systemic issues that result in a young man being murdered?
We want our community to be reinvested in, but we want to be at the table. We want to be decision makers.
I knew what Katrina did here was a result of a natural disaster. What I saw out there was a man-made disaster.
There's all kinds of amazing prison abolitionist work going on, and divestment is just one part of that.
We young, we strong, we march all day long.
It's one tactic that's a part of a much broader movement.
You can't stop the revolution! You can't stop the revolution!
And provocative commentary.
And I think women are in the forefront of the struggle against sacrifice zones because women know a thing or two about being sacrificed.
The Laura Flanders Show, weekly on Telesur, Link TV, MNN, and Free Speech TV. Our podcast is available in audio and video at lauraflanders.com. Join us.
This year will be the year that we do what we've been waiting for. This year will be the year that we stop knocking and kick down that door.
It's gonna be ending with us winning, you already know. This time we get it and go get 'em off their body, baby.
Boots Riley. Yeah, I like that. What I love in there is, I think you get a really tangible example of what both you and Danny are saying in terms of work that introduces people to folks doing work. And which again is rooted in this, Laura, your point about who briefs you is just again, from a skill sets perspective, to me is the most important question as a journalist. I mean, it just throughout my career, I can think of the number of times healthcare, I used to cover the AIDS epidemic, and I can just remember any number of press conferences with, the CDC officials or whichever health department it is, where the authority, the doctor, is in the front of the room saying things that have nothing to do with the reality that people are living, and that I would know. I mean, I think about the one of the things that used to drive me crazy is that they would, when we wanted to talk about HIV infection rates amongst gay men and risk behavior amongst gay men, it was something that I would cared deeply about. And the doctors would always repeat these stats about how often gay men did or did not use condoms, and it wasn't often enough. It was, I forget what the number was now, but whatever it was, what they would never say was that rate of condom use was twice the rate of condom use amongst heterosexual couples. So, it was, and so just that right there, that difference, which if my sources were gay men, were young gay men who were navigating risk. That where you start, what the framing of your question is, shapes everything. I think the same thing with economic reporting is where it's very clear. When I covered the foreclosure crisis as early as 2007, for me, I was like, this economy is a disaster. People are losing their homes, but you could not have told an editor that because the framing from the experts was how great things were. But in my community, people were losing their homes. My mother was in fact a source for me. She was an authority because she was experiencing this thing. And so I want you guys to start lining up for your own questions as well. But while you're doing that, I want to ask you guys just on a really nuts and bolts level. So when you get a story, when you start, where do you begin? What is your first instinct? I've said, hey, let's do this story. Or you've said, hey, Kai, I want to do this story. What is your first call or your first act? Where do you first start gathering information? I want everybody to answer that. And meanwhile, you guys be lining up for your questions.
I mean, it really depends. If I'm starting completely fresh to something, I need to know what's been said about it already and where the gaps are in the coverage that I'm hoping to fill. I'll move it along.
No, go ahead. But how do you do that?
I mean, it's, you turn on the old Google and you figure out what's been said about this story that that I know nothing about. I need to form a base of knowledge, and usually that starts with seeing how what other people have and haven't said so far.
And when you move past reading and look for sources, what's the kinds of what kinds of people are you most likely? Obviously, it'll change per story, but give a sense of what your playbook would be.
I need to find people who are doing the work that I'm interested in. It's not unlike what Danny said. I will start with advocates and activists and people who have a lot of knowledge about something. So, for instance, I covered education policy, and one policy in particular called parent trigger laws. And typical inclination might be to go find the lawmakers and the lobbyists who are pushing for this. I needed to find parent organizers, as they were called. I needed to find principals and counselors, school counselors. People rarely think about talking to a counselor, but those people know a lot about what's going on at a school. So thinking about all the levels of how a particular issue is being experienced, and then trying to find, trying to fill out those voices from there.
Sarah, on the Sheryl Sandberg story, what was your very first call?
I first got in touch with a student labor organizer who was working on the campaign, who I found through my sister, who does labor organizing in Boston. But then the sort of first contact from there, and one which I easily could have made on my own, was with a labor organizer. And then they put me in touch with a couple of the workers who were in more of a leadership role within the union struggle. And it's an interesting case because if, for example, I was reporting a slightly different story and it was about, I don't know, a divide within the union, actually going to the paid union organizer first would not have been a good thing to do, or would have been only one half of the starting point. But that's not really the story I was telling. So I was a little less concerned about that in this case. And these were leaders who had already self-identified in the media, and that was sort of the role within the movement they were playing. And I would, in this case, I was comfortable with that. I think.
Let's say it was a divide between. Let's say it was that situation where it was about a divide between the union. Where would you begin?
Well, this is where you have to be sophisticated about your subject. I mean, as Julianne said, like, you start by reading everything. Like, read a shit ton of stuff before you start, because that work has already been done. So first of all, you don't want to redo it. And second of all, your questions are as smart as what you know. So, like, go and do your reading first, obviously. And then if you're a good labor reporter and you've done your homework, what you will do is you'll have some sense at that point, like, what are the opinion divides? And maybe you'll talk to union leadership, but you'll seek out either people who have already been quoted as dissenters, or you will go to the workplace and start talking to people. I mean, it really it depends immensely. But by having done your reading and having done your sort of pre-reporting, you should know who those calls are to. I mean, I think some contexts can be very tricky where, like, when I went to Greece, that was interesting because I didn't really know Greece. And so it was the opposite of reporting on the community that you know. I was like, hello, here I am in Greece, help. And so it was actually really interesting because in that case, I got to sort of report out the broad contours of an unfolding crisis. But the second time I went back, and this ended up not turning into a story because things changed so quickly that things were becoming irrelevant. But that was when I tried to actually start by going to the working class communities that were affected where nobody spoke any English. And for that, I had to hire a fixer who could translate for me, who could get me to the right place, who could then, like, translate. I was going to a clinic who could translate, like, the doctor's forms they were using for me. It's a lot harder. And so, of course, the instinct was to go and talk to the people I already knew who were, it was relatively easy to talk to the new labor minister who, like, is Greek but came back from the States after teaching at Bard for 30 years. I knew how to talk to her already. And so getting over a language barrier and a location barrier and all these other things was much more challenging, but had to be done, obviously, to tell a reasonable story about the crisis. So, I think it depends, for me anyway, pretty massively on the story.
Danny, you've sort of answered this question already in saying, you reach out to the advocates, but let's say we dropped you into something that was like the Greece situation where you knew nobody and you knew nothing about it, but we were like, Danny is the smartest person on earth and is going to really figure this out. It's her voice we need, which we often do, right? We'll be like, this person is the voice we really want on this. So say we did that to you and it was brand new territory. What do you think, what would your instincts lead you to start? You've done your reading, you want to start talking to people. Where are you going to start?
So let's see. Well, as I mentioned, I actually have the benefit of, depends on what day you ask me. I might call it the biggest mistake of my life. But I worked in corporate media briefly, right out of journalism school. I worked at the Journal Sentinel for a couple of years covering schools in Milwaukee, and then I interned on the Miami Herald's Metro desk, and I was often in precisely that situation, like brand new in Miami, there's a fire in Hialeah, go figure it out.
And it's very much, if you are in corporate journalism, if you are in a traditional newsroom, it is your daily routine.
Right. So let's see. I mean, so there's often kind of what Sarah talked about, which is I often will ask people in my network who may have some experience there, like, where should I start? And often, you know, it doesn't have to be other journalists. It's just like people who know Miami better, or, I'm being dropped there and I have to write a story about health clinics or something. So who are my people who know about public health? Maybe they can put me in the right direction. So assuming I've already done that, and say there are no leads, I think that I would probably, you know what the story, you know what the topic is, and you go to whatever institution is going to have people affected by that around there. So like what Julianne was saying, she wanted to get outside of the kind of press hubbub in Nevada, so she went to this grocery store. That's brilliant. She went to a grocery store where she knew that the members of the community that she wanted to hear from would be there. That's like a really smart reporting tactic. You just go where you think the people who you want to talk to are going to be. And reporting isn't for the shy, or you have to figure out a way to create a persona to get, I consider myself an introvert, so I wouldn't say, I'm not the most outgoing person, but there's a way that you create your reporting persona, which it's not a fake thing, right? Because you are driven by your curiosity. And so in these situations where you're starting from scratch and you don't know anybody, you have to be really open and willing to talk to folks, and willing to hear what they have to say, whatever they have to say, even if it goes against what you kind of thought the story was going to be, or kind of expected them to want to share with you. So that's what I would say.
Well, when I went to Ireland that first time, I think I went to the Women's Centre. And there was a Women's Centre those days on the Falls Road in West Belfast. And I think I still do that to some extent, not go to women's centers, but go to a place, go to an event, a public event maybe. You see a little bit of who is doing what. I did a book about sort of progressive left groups in red states. It was called Blue Grit. It was about how grassroots groups were doing what the Democrats were not doing. And for the bit in Nevada, I went and just hung out in the Union Hall for a while. You gradually kind of meet people. I think being where the action is a good idea, and you got to get a sense of who the different players are. I think one of the other challenges, though, is to, particularly as you've been doing this for a long time, is to keep asking new people. And one way that I prompt myself to do that nowadays is to ask people in my just social circle, or even on my Facebook page, what's your question? If you knew that I was going to New Orleans to cover the 10th anniversary of the Katrina disaster, what would your questions be? What are you curious about? Because it may be that I think I know too much already, or I'm already so set in my ways about what my questions are. So to keep stirring up your questions, ask your grandmother, ask your sisters, brothers, your school friends who are not journalists. Like, what is it about this that you do or don't understand, or that you're just what questions would you ask? Because those, and then write them down. Because those very first questions that somebody without a whole lot of research has in their minds are the ones among all the others that you're going to want to answer in your reporting. Because if your goal is to give as much, to introduce as many people as possible to each other and to ideas, then you don't want to cut out all the people who are not as smart as you are about this subject. You have to bring them along, or at least that's the project of the great editor, is to balance the bringing along of new people with the going deep for the people that have been deep into this story. So I would say ask your sources, but then ask people in your social circle what they want to know.
Humans, people who are not professing power. I invariably start with service providers and churches myself, but that's because I report in the South a lot, and you can't do much in the South without a church. So. Okay, so I'm gonna steal Laura's wonderful technique of 3 at a time. So the first folks just give me your name and your question, and if you have somebody in particular you want to answer it, then note that too. So please.
Hi, my name's Eliana. I go to the University of Scranton. I'm wondering kind of if you can talk a little bit more about the explanation element of reporting and how important or not important it is to give background information when you're covering a story, especially if you're covering a developing story that you write a lot of pieces for, how much background information you're supposed to give each time you write it, and kind of your thought process through that and what you consider.
Great question.
Hi, I'm Anna. I go to Syracuse University. So my question is, do you think it's equally impactful or valuable, if not more so, to write critical social justice movement pieces within big media corporations, like If You Can, or like maybe try to push and like really advocate for those spaces versus just writing it in kind of like spaces that had to be created, such as The Nation, considering like, there is certain audiences that are more likely to read The Nation versus like New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera. And the idea of just disruption in general, what that means. So, thanks.
Great.
Hi. Oh, God, I'm time short. Hi, I'm Karen. I'm at UCLA, and I have to give a little context right now. So I think Danny said that the general public doesn't understand what organizing is. Well, my school, administration, and even students don't understand what advocacy journalism is. And after 2008, 2009, when that happened, there are 7 news magazines within UCLA student media that all the budgets were cut, and we were the first to go. So let me list all 7 of them. The communities: Jewish, Muslim, Asian Pacific Islander, Desi American, Latinx, Black, feminist magazine. There's just like so many, and we got 0 funding from then on until now. So I was just wanted to ask, how do we go about reaching out to the community and pushing administration to kind of like understand our mission so that we can continually provide coverage for communities of color?
Great. Okay, so how do we get resources for journalism about communities of color? How do we balance explanatory reporting inside ongoing stories and reporting in community media and advocacy media versus trying to be in corporate journalism? Julian, can I throw the explanatory reporting piece to you, because I feel like this comes up a great deal with the work you do, both in covering immigration policy and education policy. There's like all this really dense background that you have to know each time you go into a story, every time a reader picks up a story on what are secure communities and how do you deal with that?
Right, so that was the question that I actually knew. I thought of a problem right away where I've dealt with that question that Eliana, you asked. So in 2009, 2010, undocumented immigrant youth led and almost won, they just by 5 votes in the Senate, almost passed the DREAM Act, the Federal DREAM Act. And it was a huge national fight. And I was covering that story on a daily basis, sometimes in this was when I was at Color Lines and Kai was my editor there. I was covering it sometimes in short blog posts and sometimes in a weekly feature, and then sometimes in something that was like 2,500 words. And so after a while, I've just like got numbers and stuff coming out of my ears. I remember that I was covering this so much that I wrote one blog post where I never even defined what the DREAM Act was, and then a commenter called me out on it. So like a baseline of information is necessary at all times, but it really depends on the speed and the depth of the piece anyway. The problem that I tend to save. I in my stories, I tend to write my leads last because they're really hard for me. And I usually start about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through my piece. And like, I jump around from different parts of the piece that I'm working on. But I usually save the explanatory part for the last because it's sort of, It's sort of like, okay, here, let's gather all the information, let's regurgitate it for each other and ourselves, so we remind ourselves why we've gathered here anyway. And sometimes it means having to be very concise and also reductive and cutting out huge parts of information. I suffer from thinking that everything is important, and that's where my
Great
editor-
many reporters suffer from thinking everything is important. I can tell you as an editor.
And so that's where Kai comes in. And Kai's, with his compassionate red pen is like slicing things out of my pieces. But it just really depends, Eliana, is what I would say on how much, what your word limit is to begin with. And Karen, I would also say, if I could just quickly, I've been out of college for a while, but when I was in college and also did independent media, there were places that funded outside of the school that I was at, which was UC Irvine, which funded independent student media. At the time, Campus Progress, an arm of Center for American Progress, funded student journalism, and I can't speak to whether or not that's an option today. But there are options. There's also, pressuring and shaming your campus administration, and then there's also thankfully other avenues that are open to other independent media makers today, like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, if it needs to come to that. But I do like the public campaign, especially if you've wrestled with your administration already in private and your student government and rallied, whatever support you have. Take your fight public.
Quickly, does anybody else have any tangible ideas about getting resources for community-driven journalism?
I mean, there is, of course, the primary goal, the primary requirement is you make your work as cheap as possible. I mean, there's no way around it. All of us have to learn how to do our work as cost-effectively, is a better way of putting it, as cost-effectively as possible. We're not going to have the budgets of the money media. We're just not. So this show that you've just seen, for example, has taken place on many, many different platforms in many different forms. I now think of myself as a kind of surfer. I'll ride this funding wave for a little while, and then I'll ride that funding wave for a little while. And sometimes I'm producing out of my house, and sometimes I'm producing out of the YouTube studio, which is free if you have 5,000 subscribers or more. You take your opportunities where you can. You figure out, I shot the whole film that is right now on the website about Ireland. I shot on my iPhone with a monopod and a few extended speakers and microphones. I mean, if you're going to do this kind of reporting, before you do any of this about who you're going to talk to, you need to figure out what is the minimum requirement that you need for funding. And then if you get more, fantastic. In fact, Katrina and Sarah helped me apply for a Pulitzer Center Foundation grant to go to Ireland, which made all the difference. There are resources. Your editors can help. But learning how to raise the money, I'm afraid, if you're in this business, is part of the deal. You are going to be media entrepreneurs of one kind or another. So, I think
especially if you want to write about communities of color. It's just
I'm afraid so. It's not like there was a golden age where there was tons of money for this.
Never for talking about people of color. Never. Nobody gives a shit. And not people with money. And so that's true both as an organization, but then as an individual journalist. Your stories are never going to get.
And what Julianne said is absolutely right. So simultaneously fight like hell, because it shouldn't be this way, and figure out how to do it anyway.
Go ahead,
I just had one more. So, Karen, you mentioned this happened after 2007. Was that just like budgets got cut across the board, or did these publications do something? Am I looking at the right person? No, yeah. Sorry. Or was this some kind of backlash to something? Like, was the administration trying to, shut you down because these publications had done something?
Give a shit. They don't care about diversity. They just care about the look of diversity that we talked about. In terms of student media, the administrators overseeing us, that are full-time staff members, or just the board that looks at us, they have prioritized taking care of Daily Bruin, which is the campus newspaper. And in consequence, to save the flagship publication, they had cut all funding since 2009.
Yeah, I think Julianne makes it, and Laura said the same thing. I think what we have as journalists often overlap with the same skills that good organizers have and activists have, which is how to research, how to message, you know how to frame stories. So yeah, I mean, some things are a story and some things are a campaign. And I would figure out how to partner with student groups on campus and like create a huge ruckus and shame them.
You're on the campus of June Jordan. Her poem to whoever there was, Ferlinghetti, wasn't it? When he became poet laureate of of California, her poem about how he had called poets of color representative poets versus real poets, and she went to town. I would go and plaster it on the walls all around campus.
Right, because it's true, as you say, which I would assume it is, that what they care about is the look of diversity. Make them look bad. Like, you know, you can do that. And presumably you exist because you have a constituency. And that constituency cares and can, as others have said, make a big deal out of things. And right now there are a lot of campaigns going on about the racism of university administrations. And because some of those campaigns have gotten traction, it actually creates a space where more campaigns might get traction, and it's considered a live and important issue in a way that it hasn't always been, due to a lot of really impressive activists. So yeah, I mean, public shaming is a great tactic for universities.
Thing. It's a wonderful thing. Anna's question, I want us to overlook the impact, choosing between trying to tell these kinds of stories in mainstream media, mainstream corporate media, and versus community-based media. Maybe Danny, you have actually made this choice in different ways. Maybe you could speak to that.
I mean, it's something that I think about a lot. To me, what has made me feel sane and good about myself, and you know, as I try to structure a career, is doing both. I feel like I did really important work at the Journal Sentinel. I was there for a couple of years, and I worked with editors who. Let me back up to say this. So I was like very ignorant about journalism. I went to Columbia's journalism school, and I got there in August of 2005. So within 2 weeks of school starting, Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast. Some of the things that were said in my classes, from not just my colleagues, my fellow students, but from professors, were shocking to me. I had this idea that journalists were the smartest people on earth. I grew up, you know, watching 60 Minutes with my family and loving Ed Bradley and thinking that journalists understood power. And when I got to J School, I realized most people do not have a power analysis. And that when people have the ability to write the first drafts of history, as we say, and they don't have a power analysis, it is so dangerous. And I realized that these people, because they were at Columbia, were going to go on to be reporters and editors at the New York Times and at the, you know, the publications and the media outlets that shape our whole understanding of what this country is about. And I thought about dropping out. I was just like terrified. So what I realized though was when I did get into newsrooms was that while most of my colleagues didn't understand power and they didn't have a background in organizing and they just thought that like there's no problem with, you know, the State Department briefing, as Laura said. That's so true, and you'll see it. Some crime happens and you listen to the police department say what they think about this particular issue, right? Or something happens in schools and you hear from the PIO of the school the school district, not from parents and teachers and students. So what I realized was that even though that was the orientation of many of the people that I was working with, they had skills that I didn't have and that I needed to learn from them. And so because I was getting those skills and getting that guidance from like people who had been in the newsroom covering Milwaukee for 30 years, I was able to tell some of the types of stories that I wanted to tell. And my stories were better because I was learning from journalists with decades of experience. At the same time, culturally, working in those environments was not a fit for me because I had to be so in the closet about my politics that after a while it just wore on me. And so what I've found to work for myself is, and you know, we'll see, I'm not sure if this is still possible for me at this point in my career, but I really like going back and forth. I really think it's helpful to be in these corporate news environments, learn, you know, get access to all their technology and all their money that they have to send you all over the place, and because they're so well resourced, and there are also, you know, some smart people working there. What's that?
Sorry, I was being shady, which is why they're going out of business.
Yeah, true. But yeah, I would say that it's if it's possible and if you think you can stomach it, try both. And I don't mean to say, I mean, I started off by saying that like these people weren't smart, but like there are intelligent people who care pretty much anywhere you go, and you can learn from them, and you can find allies, and you can hopefully find the people who also want to tell the types of stories you want to tell, or even if they don't agree with you, they can kind of help you.
Can I?
Quickly, and then I want to get to other folks.
I just wanted to say there are all these new media organizations like BuzzFeed and Fusion that have placed a premium on a sort of quasi-progressive and diversely staffed reporting. And this has been really interesting because these are not necessarily good institutions overall, and the way that they're structuring things like advertising and their resistance to unionization on the parts of their staff, all of these are bad things. However, there is nothing wrong with taking their money, and you should take as much of their money as you can. And if it's a place where you can learn something, then you should go and learn it. And I know a lot of reporters who have gone to those places very young and have done like 2 incredibly intense years of being like the breaking news reporter, and BuzzFeed puts them on a plane like every 12 hours, and their life is kind of hell, but they learn a lot and they make a living. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's great. And ultimately, as Danny was saying, I think the type of newsroom you choose to work in, whether it's on the left or whether it's super, super mainstream, depends on your temperament. And I would not fight your temperament. You know, like there are good people doing good work, investigative work, you know, really taking down the bad guys at the New York Times, at 60 Minutes, whatever. And there are people doing equally good and impressive work in explicitly left spaces. And for me, I like working in left spaces because it sort of drives me crazy to have to fight against an apolitical environment sometimes. But if you don't feel that way and you feel like I can just do my stories and I don't really mind if someone else is covering like, I don't know, vacation rentals, cool, like totally do that. And I don't think there's a moral question there. I think it's temperamental and it depends on what's there.
And your temperament at the time, we're past where you're in a place, I think, where you have to have chosen one or the other. I think one of the great things about where we're headed is...
I have to leave. I am so sorry.
I'm
I would
sorry,
stay
yes.
here for ages. I'm not leaving in a huff. And I would just say, once you've thought about your other options, I am right now looking for a fantastic executive producer. Any of you could apply. Talk to me at any time. If you pick up a pen, it has my website on it. And good luck to all of you. I'm really glad you're here. It's been an honor to be with you.
Thank you, Laura. One of the smartest people in journalism. Okay. Name, if you're directing it to someone, let me know.
Okay. My name is Ben. I go to Fordham University. And I was opening this to all of everyone. How do you develop the balance between the qualitative aspects of stories, so the personal vignettes, the very depth, spending time talking to people and hearing their stories, with the more quantitative aspects of the numbers, the stats, the data that allows you to generalize and really examine, is this the way things are, or is this the difference between the reality and what people are just feeling? Because I feel like the social movements lend themselves more towards the qualitative aspects and move away from the quantitative aspects. And you don't necessarily get a sense is what these people feel, what the movement is organizing around is really the representation of reality.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Joe Hogan. I'm at NYU. First, thank you very much for all of your remarks. I have a question that I'd like to put to Sarah. I'm really interested and fascinated by the idea of ideas journalism. I'm really interested in that, and your work not just at The Nation, but also at Dissent and The New Inquiry sort of gives you unique insight into the world of little magazines and journals about ideas. I'm wondering, to what degree do you think that ideas and debates about ideas can be on the front end of movements and help guide them? And by contrast, to what degree do you think that ideas and debates exist at the back end of movements and help clarify differences? I think both can be true, but I'm just wondering to what I guess I'm wondering because I'd like to be an ideas journalist and I'd like to think of myself as like leading the way with movements, but I also wonder if actually movements and social change is led by really visceral reactions to social inequities, and then we just debate about things on the back end to sort of clarify. So thanks very much.
Interesting. Let's get, well, we have both of you.
Hi.
Because you've already got to ask us a lot of questions, but go ahead.
Hi, my name is Carlos. I'm from Chicago. And I guess a question for the entire panel. I think something that I've been dealing with this last year back at school, being a student journalist, is the issue of becoming trustworthy to the people, to the movements you're covering, and to the communities you're covering. I think there's a general mistrust of the media as a general societal sense, and I think getting past that is really difficult, especially for new journalists, and especially like in school environments. And I guess I was wondering if the panel has like any tips, pointers to kind of go beyond that initial barrier that might happen.
Hi, I'm Will. I'm from Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and I'm the incoming editor-in-chief of our campus newspaper. My question is, how can we, like me as a future editor-in-chief, empower people from actual diverse communities and diverse viewpoints to contribute to our student newspaper? And we're lucky enough to have an independent student newspaper that is profitable, which is, it's incredible. I still don't understand how it's possible, but we have very nice advertisers. But I was just wondering how we can empower students from diverse opinions, especially in a place like Hopkins, which many people think of as apolitical, even though it's smack dab in the middle of Baltimore. And we want to cover more stuff in the Baltimore community, but it's hard to reach out to people who have real perspective on that and are willing to put their voices out there in a college that's not as politically active as other campuses.
Let me follow up on that question just to make sure I understand. So you have tried to get people to contribute, and they've said, we don't want to do that.
Exactly, yeah.
And what reason, and the reason they gave for not doing it?
Mistrust of the media in general, and about how we would treat their stories, and more of like a favorable view. They want a favorable view of.
So these are sources or writers or both?
Both. Yeah, we've had writers who have been like, I'm only going to cover this if I think I can do this whatever I want and skew it the way. And they've literally said things like, skew it the way I want to. And sources are like, if you don't cover this exactly what we're saying, then we're not going to talk to you at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so given our time, I'm going to take prerogative on two of the questions that I have dealt with myself many times. Ben's question on data versus quantitative, I think it's false divide. In covering healthcare and in covering the economy, this is a constant debate. And a constant thing to struggle with is whether your story is driven by data or driven by people. I think that a lot of times claiming to be driven by data is hiding subjective ideas that you can turn into data. See under my example about condom use rates. And so I think it's a both and it must be a both and I think that you, in the best case scenarios, are gathering one and testing them against each other as a journalist. On Will's question as an editor who has struggled with this in all kinds of ways, you got to walk the walk. If people don't trust you, you gotta show them why they should trust you. You can't just show up and be like, trust me. So no one's saying it's easy to correct you. I was the first black editor in 150 years in Nation magazine, So, we go on about our desire for diversity, but it's going to take time before we can get a whole lot of people to show up and write for us because we spent 150 years not sowing that trust, and so you're going to have to sow some trust. And it may be that your following editor is the person who reaps the rewards of your work in sowing the trust and being told no a lot because it's the right thing to do. Okay, Sarah.
Okay, so I guess we've used it in this room, but I find the term ideas journalism odd, honestly.
I introduced it, so I apologize.
How could you? It's essay writing. I mean, it's a really old form. I mean, a great polemical essay reveals the contradictions of your opponent. A great historical essay brings a depth of knowledge to bear that typically other sorts of writing don't. There are many forms it can take. I think something that's important to understand is that it's also important for someone writing about ideas to be embedded in a community. And so for me, what that means is like, I'm not an ideas journalist, I'm a leftist. So I have specific questions. And for me, that question might be, okay, so like everybody's talking about basic income for some reason. I'm like, okay, that's an interesting idea. That's existed on the left, on the right. What do we think about this? And the reason I'm thinking about it is because I'm interested in certain things like, how does everybody have enough money in this world? Like, how do we structure society in a way that's democratic? And so when I go to look at that question, I'm coming from that perspective. And so, I'm able to look at the libertarian version and be like, well, interesting. They want to give everybody money, but then take away all of our social services. Like, that seems bad. And I can look at sort of a left-wing version of that and be like, okay, let's take a historical perspective. They've tried this to some degree, I think, in Brazil. How did that work? Why were labor unions against it? What does that mean? Why was their family support program more popular? What does that mean? And so any essay, any sort of ideas piece, I guess, should have an argument. And that's going to structure the sorts of questions you ask, the type of research you do, and it's going to make it worthwhile for someone else to read. Now, there are a lot of sort of ideas pieces that I think come from people that are not embedded in a community that cares about the issues they're talking about. So this happens all the time with Black Lives Matter, I think. And like, Danny is like a great counterpoint to that, where like you actually care about the stakes of this movement, have a sense of who the people are. But there are like a billion essays out there by like random magazine writer who's like, this is what's happening, I have thoughts. And they don't know shit, And so that is a form of ideas writing, where they'll come in and be like, wow, this movement is like really disrupting people when they talk. Like, I don't think that's democratic because it's a violation of First Amendment rights. And you're like, have you talked to anybody? Like, so you can have good and bad and embedded and unembedded ideas writing in the same way that you do with normal reporting. And I would encourage you always to be thinking about where you stand in relation to the ideas that you're writing about and why you're writing about them in the first place.
That's a great answer. So either Julianne or Danny, on Carlos's question about building trust from movements that you're covering.
Yeah, Carlos, I mean, I think it goes on a like movement scale and a one-on-one scale. I was taught to mind my own business, and if people say they don't want to talk to me or, to believe them, but my job requires me to keep like knocking on people's doors, and I've had to wait outside people's doors for people to come home and let them know that I take their concerns seriously.
It is a fine line between stalking and reporting.
Fine line, very fine line. Yeah, I think it's a little bit of your work will speak for itself. But you have to get your foot in the door with someone first. But when your sources see that you are fair and responsible, that you write and report with integrity, that's the kind of thing that will help people, even if they disagree with you. If they can see that you handle ideas and differences with fairness, I think that people will be more willing to open up. I will say, Ben, one thing is that this idea about quantitative journalism really irks me because, I don't think that journalists can get away these days without knowing a little bit about statistics and being able to read, dig into research methodology. You can't report on polls or studies without being able to understand how the data was collected. But a lot of what will happen when you dig into the methodology of reports and studies is that you realize that data collection is also a very human endeavor and is driven by the sorts of questions that people ask. And so those numbers are fallible. So to echo what Kai was saying, it's a
Which is why you got to test them against one another. I mean, a lot of times you'll find that you'll look at one piece of, authority or not authority will give you a set of data about a question that you've got. That doesn't add up to what you're hearing from people who are experiencing it, and you'll keep looking and find more data that actually either deepens or challenges the data that you started with. So that's particularly true on the economy, right? Like you can start with, we have the unemployment in New York City is down to X. But everywhere you look, people are like, I don't have a job. And then you look for more data, and it turns out, well, unemployment is down because a lot of people have left the workforce altogether, right? So it has to be both and that you're doing in order to really be wrestling with it.
There's a really good, I just want to say you should look up, there's an amazing essay by Christopher Lasch that is literally about this, and his argument is that being engaged in democratic debate produces information. It does not come from information. So like when you're asking questions and you're like, why does it seem like everyone's unemployed and yet we're being told everything's fine? Like that causes you to go seek out information. It produces information. You don't like have the information to start with and then like build a case out of what you think. Like you're structuring that process from where you sort of stand on the question to begin with. What's it called? I think the essay is called, it's about transparency, technically. The idea that more and more data produces a more informed citizenry. And he's like, more data does not produce a more informed citizenry. A more engaged citizenry produces the information that we actually need.
Danny, last word on building trust, both of movements and with sources and writers.
Right, so hopefully this is helpful to both Carlos and Will. So I think one of the reasons people lack trust in the media is because they don't really understand what it is that we do. So Carlos's specific question, I think yours was about building trust with people that you cover, with sources, right? So I think one thing that I do and that I think is important is you explain to them what you're doing. So I'm writing a story, I'll be talking to you and I'll be talking to a whole bunch of other people. When we talk, because you know that I'm coming to you as a reporter, everything we talk about is on the record. But if you say something and you realize, actually, I don't want that to be something that shows up in print, you can let me know that. There are also certain things you can say and tell me that's on background, meaning like check into that, but I don't, so there are all these tricks, there are kind of the rules of engagement that we know that people don't know. And then when we don't explain those things to them and they're like, wow, oh my God, they see the finished product and then they feel really betrayed. But I think we can get around that by, explaining up front what it is that we do. And I think that also goes to Will's question. Like, if you're, trying to diversify your roster of contributors, and they're saying things like, well, or even sources, well, we just want this to show up. It needs to be covered exactly the way that we're telling you. And you say, well, maybe what you'd like to do is write an op-ed because I'm actually approaching you as a reporter and that's not what we do, right? And so would you like to contribute an op-ed? Or you're really upset about this piece that you saw that we ran last week. Do you know that you can write a letter to the editor? A big piece of this is media literacy because people just think that we as the media have all the power and there are all these ways that they can clap back that they don't even know about. So I think, I see that as a big part of my job is to help people understand not only what it is I do, but how what their rights are as sources and what is possible to them as contributors.
And Peter, we are going to stop, but the last thing I just want to add on to that for Carlos is part of it also in building trust, particularly in movement spaces, is a lot of people, in things you have to explain is that I am not actually going to help you. What I have run into time and time again is the motivation of a lot of your sources are people who believe they're going to talk to you because you personally are going to help them. And I think it's ethically important to point out this is not, what you're doing now is telling your story, and that's going to help other people. And it may help you, but I'm not a service provider in this moment. And I think that transparency in general about who you are and where you're coming from helps a lot. So with that, I think we got to end. Thank you much. Thank our wonderful panelists, and I think we're going to be around with you all day.